My dad needed a YTV 400 surgery. I called my husband for help. He said, "Var, we just bought a lake home. Figure it out yourself." Then my mother-in-law took the phone and added, "Stop calling my son. Go ask your own family." I remember staring at the hospital hallway as her words echoed through the speaker. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. A nurse pushed an empty wheelchair past me, its wheels squeaking against the polished floor. Behind the double doors, my father lay on a narrow bed wearing a faded hospital gown, trying to smile every time I looked his way, pretending he wasn't afraid. My hand tightened around my phone until my knuckles turned white. I waited for my husband to laugh and say it was a terrible joke. Instead, I heard a car door slam in the background, followed by cheerful voices discussing paint colors for the new lake house they had celebrated only 2 days earlier. The call disconnected, not because of bad reception, because they had decided the conversation was over. For 8 years, I had been the dependable wife. I remembered birthdays no one else remembered. I stayed late helping his mother after her knee replacement. I quietly covered bills when his business struggled. Every sacrifice had been filed away in my mind as something married people simply did for each other. Yet when my father needed one surgery, one chance to avoid losing his mobility, I was suddenly on my own. The silence that followed their rejection was louder than any argument. I looked through the glass window into my father's room. He caught my eye and lifted a weak thumb, trying to comfort me when he was the one lying in a hospital bed. That was the moment something inside me became very still. Not angry, not hysterical, just finished. I slipped my phone into my purse, wiped my face before anyone could see the tears, and walked toward the billing office with steady steps. I didn't know exactly how I would find the money, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I would never ask my husband, or his mother, for anything again. My name is Claire, and until that day, I believed loyalty was something that accumulated over time, that years of showing up for people would eventually matter when you needed them most. I had been married to Daniel for 8 years, and somewhere along the way, I stopped noticing that our marriage had become a one-way bridge. I carried the weight. He crossed whenever it was convenient. Daniel was charming in public, generous when there was an audience, and careful with appearances. Friends admired how successful we looked together. They never saw that every family holiday, every birthday gift, every emergency plan, and every difficult conversation quietly landed on my shoulders. I handled the details so he could enjoy the credit. His mother, Lorraine, encouraged that arrangement without ever saying it outright. She treated her son's comfort as the center of every room, and everyone else's needs as background noise. If Daniel forgot something, it was because he was busy. If I made a mistake, it became evidence that I expected too much from him. My father had raised me differently. After my mother died when I was 20, he worked overtime, skipped vacations, and somehow still found the energy to call every Sunday just to ask if I'd eaten well. He never measured love by money. He measured it by presence. That difference became impossible to ignore after I married into Daniel's family. When Daniel's business struggled 3 years earlier, I quietly emptied nearly all of my savings to keep us afloat. I never asked for repayment. I told myself that marriage wasn't a ledger. When Lorraine needed rides to physical therapy after her knee surgery, I rearranged my work schedule for 6 straight weeks while Daniel insisted he was too busy. Neither of them ever said thank you. They simply expected I would keep saying yes. Over time, I became invisible in the role I had created for myself, the dependable wife who solved problems before anyone else noticed them. They mistook my patience for weakness, my kindness for obligation, and my silence for permission. They underestimated the one thing that changes a person forever, the moment they discover exactly how much they are worth to the people they have spent years protecting. The days after my father's surgery blurred together in quiet routines. I spent my mornings at the hospital before work and my evenings beside his bed, listening to the steady rhythm of the heart monitor while helping him relearn the smallest movements. Daniel never visited. He texted once to ask if I had remembered to forward an insurance document that had arrived at the house. There wasn't a single question about my father. When I finally returned home to pick up more clothes, I found glossy brochures spread across the kitchen island. They were filled with photographs of docks, boats, and lakeside furniture. Daniel had circled expensive patio sets with a black marker. A receipt lay beside them for a custom outdoor fireplace that cost nearly twice what my father's surgery had. He looked up from his laptop, offered a brief smile that never reached his eyes, and asked, "How's your dad doing?" Before I could finish answering, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, stood, and walked into another room, leaving my sentence hanging in the empty kitchen. It was a small moment, almost forgettable, except that it wasn't the first, or the 100th. At Sunday dinners, Lorraine would compliment the meals I cooked before, casually mentioning that Daniel had worked so hard to provide this life. If I corrected a detail, she would tilt her head, smile politely, and change the subject as though my words had drifted past unheard. Daniel always noticed. He simply never interrupted. I began paying attention to the spaces between conversations, the pauses after. I spoke. The quick exchange of glances between mother and son. The practiced way they dismissed me without ever raising their voices. Their disrespect wasn't loud enough for outsiders to recognize. It was quiet, careful, refined enough to make me question whether I had imagined it at all. My father came home a week later, moving slowly with the help of a walker. The surgery had been successful because I had borrowed money, sold a few pieces of jewelry my mother left me, and taken on extra freelance work without telling anyone. It wasn't easy, but every painful sacrifice reminded me of one simple truth. When my family needed me, I found a way. When Daniel had the chance to do the same, he chose a vacation property instead. The real turning point came on a quiet Thursday evening. I stopped by the lake house for the first time. Daniel had insisted I should at least see what we bought, as though the place itself could
erase the memory of that phone call.
The house was beautiful. Sunlight shimmered across the water, and the new patio furniture had already been delivered. Lorraine stood on the deck admiring the view while discussing where to place flower boxes. Then she noticed the small jewelry box in my hand. "What happened to your mother's necklace?" she asked. "I sold it," I answered. The words settled over the deck like a sudden drop in temperature. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them asked why. Neither of them apologized. Daniel only looked toward the lake and quietly said, "You probably should have told me before selling something valuable." That was it. Not concern, not regret, just mild irritation that I had made a decision without consulting him. Standing there, I finally understood that I had spent years waiting for people to become the version of themselves I believed existed. They weren't cruel in dramatic ways. They simply believed my sacrifices were expected and theirs were optional. As I drove away from the lake house, I didn't feel heartbroken anymore. I felt clear. For the first time since that call outside the operating room, I wasn't wondering how to save my marriage. I was deciding how to leave it on my terms. I didn't announce that I wanted a divorce. I didn't threaten Daniel or argue with Lorraine. People who underestimated me expected tears, long conversations, and one more chance to explain themselves. Instead, I gave them something they had never bothered to notice: silence. Every lunch break became a planning session. I gathered bank statements, mortgage records, tax returns, and copies of every document with both our names on it. Years earlier, I had worked as a contracts administrator for a construction firm, where I learned that emotions rarely mattered on paper. Dates, signatures, transfers, and records told cleaner stories than angry speeches ever could. The more I organized, the more patterns emerged. Money I had contributed toward our shared future had quietly financed Daniel's ambitions. My savings had rescued his struggling business. My bonuses had gone toward renovations on the marital home. Even the down payment for the lake house had been supplemented with funds from a joint investment account that I had built long before he ever mentioned buying waterfront property. I scheduled a meeting with a family law attorney without telling anyone. I brought neatly labeled folders instead of complaints. The attorney spent nearly an hour reviewing the documents before looking up and saying, "You've kept excellent records." That sentence stayed with me, not because it promised victory, because it confirmed I wasn't imagining what had happened. I left the office with a clear understanding of my legal options and a list of practical steps: separate my income, protect my remaining assets, redirect important mail, and avoid discussing any plans until everything was in place. For weeks, I followed that advice with quiet precision. Daniel mistook my calmness for acceptance. Lorraine assumed I had finally learned my place. Neither of them realized that every ordinary day they enjoyed was another day. I was carefully building the exit they would never see coming. The papers were served on a Tuesday morning. I knew exactly where Daniel would be because he followed the same routine every week. By the time his phone lit up with my name, I had already moved the last of my belongings into a small apartment 10 minutes from my father's house. The walls were plain, the furniture didn't match, and the windows overlooked a busy parking lot instead of a lake. For the first time in years, it felt peaceful. I didn't answer his first call, or the next 6. Instead, I transferred the utilities into his name, closed our joint credit card according to my attorney's instructions, and emailed copies of every financial record we had assembled. There were no accusations, no dramatic messages, just facts, organized in the same careful order they had always existed. 3 days later, someone began pounding on my front door. Not knocking, pounding. I looked through the peephole and saw Daniel standing on the porch, his expensive jacket wrinkled, his confidence replaced by confusion. Behind him, Lorraine sat stiffly in the passenger seat of his SUV, refusing to get out but watching the building with folded arms. I opened the door only as far as the security chain allowed. "What is this?" Daniel demanded, holding the envelope in one hand. "You could have talked to me." I met his eyes without raising my voice. "I did." He frowned. "The day my father needed surgery." The hallway fell silent. For the first time since we'd met, Daniel had nothing to say. He searched my face for hesitation, for guilt, for the woman who always softened first. She wasn't there anymore. I closed the door gently, not with anger, but with certainty. The sound of the latch sliding into place was quiet. It was also the loudest answer he had ever received. News traveled faster than I expected, but not in the way Daniel had hoped. Friends and relatives eventually learned why our marriage had ended, not because I launched a campaign against him, but because the facts were impossible to hide. When people asked why I had left, I answered with the same calm sentence every time. My father needed a $300-400 surgery, and my husband chose a lake house instead. I never added anything else. I didn't have to. The silence after that sentence always did the work for me. Some mutual friends quietly stopped inviting Daniel to gatherings. Others reached out to me, admitting they had always noticed how often I carried the emotional weight in our marriage but assumed I was happy doing it. Even a few members of his extended family called to apologize, not for what they had done, but for never recognizing what had been happening in plain sight. Lorraine never contacted me again. Whether it was pride or embarrassment, I never found out. My father recovered steadily. Every week he walked a little farther, laughed a little more, and reminded me that real family isn't defined by legal papers or shared last names. It's revealed in the moments when helping someone costs you something. That was the lesson Daniel never understood. Money wasn't what ended our marriage. Neither was the lake house. It was the decision he made in a hospital hallway, without ever setting foot in it. People often believe betrayal arrives with shouting, slammed doors, or dramatic confessions. Sometimes it arrives quietly. Sometimes it's just 4 words. Figure it out yourself. And sometimes those 4 words reveal exactly who deserves a place in your life, and who never truly earned one. A year has passed since I closed that door. The borrowed money for my father's surgery has been repaid, one careful payment at a time. Dad no longer needs the walker. Every Saturday morning we sit on the small balcony outside my apartment with coffee in our hands, watching the neighborhood wake up. It isn't a lake view, but it reminds me that peace has never depended on expensive scenery. It depends on the people willing to stand beside you when life asks something difficult. The divorce was finalized, without the dramatic courtroom battle everyone seemed to expect. My records spoke for themselves. My attorney handled the details. I simply kept moving forward. I heard through mutual friends that Daniel rarely visits the lake house anymore. They say it feels different now. Too quiet. Too empty. I don't know if that's true, and I no longer feel the need to find out. Whatever consequences followed him belonged to his choices, not to my revenge. People sometimes ask whether I regret leaving. I always smile before answering. I regret asking the wrong person for help, because that's what this was really about. Not the money, not the surgery, not even the marriage. It was about discovering the difference between people who love you and people who simply enjoy being loved by you. For years, I believed strength meant enduring disappointment without complaint. Now I understand that real strength is recognizing when your kindness has become someone else's entitlement, and quietly refusing to participate any longer. I didn't destroy Daniel's life. I simply stopped carrying it. And when I finally set that weight down, he was forced to feel the burden he had spent years leaving on my shoulders. The greatest revenge wasn't watching him pound on my front door. It was knowing that when he did, I no longer needed him to walk through it. Some doors are meant to be closed, not out of anger, but out of self-respect. And sometimes the quiet click of a lock is the first sound a person makes after finally finding their own peace.